Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Intrepid audience members coming out on a Saturday morning. We're really grateful again for your participation. So we're excited today to have two great panels, and then maybe you'll indulge me a few minutes of closing remarks after that. But most importantly, our panels. Today's kind of a pivot from sort of scene-setting problem statements to some initial examples of responses and strategies. But today I think we're going to really open up the system boundaries of this discussion to consider all the things that we fail to consider typically in the conventional architectural practice and also in the way we think about our activities within the building sector, even globally. And so the first really is about the neglected sources of knowledge that can really inform us as we move forward with this challenge of solving climate change through the means that we have, tools that we have. And then the second is really trying to discern and define the conditions that we need established for us to take action. And again, it won't be conclusive, but we hope it spurs a lot of thought. So I think, again, I want to say how incredibly honored I am that the speakers here have convened to offer their insights. And I'll start by introducing my dear colleague, Ana Maria Duran Calisto, who's the Daniel Rose Visiting Assistant Professor here, teaching urban theory, theories of extractivism, and she's an intrepid researcher of extractive practices in Amazonia, and also, I would say, a pretty disciplined chronicler of the opportunities that the indigenous Amazonian communities offer us for the stewardship of the commons. So with that, I'm going to invite Ana to the mic. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. First of all, I would like to thank Alan for this incredible symposium, so beautifully curated, and of course also to Deborah, Martin, Phil, and everyone who supports this type of conversation here at the Yale School of Architecture. I love the title of this first panel, Regoverning. I love the RE as well, which is, aligned with what we've been discussing in this symposium. Regoverning the commons, new and neglected knowledge networks. And I have to say that maybe my view is a view from the global south. So I don't want to sound anti-technological, but what happens when you come from the areas that are being extracted, every innovation in technology, in a way, we receive with immense dread. As you may have noticed when you look at the graphs of fossil fuel consumption, for example, you will notice that since the 90s, the consumption of fossil fuels has increased dramatically. And it doesn't have to do only with what was mentioned yesterday, which is economic growth and population growth. It has to do with the deployment of digital technologies. And right now we have AI. And as you know, AI demands immense quantities of water and immense quantities of energy. And I'm not an anti-AI person. I love it. I think that, for example, in archaeology, archaeologists are applying AI to unveil patterns of ancient cities in the Americas, and they're helping us to understand even what the demography was at the time. So the applications are wonderful. But I'm wondering whether we can actually afford AI in the 21st century. So I do have my dreads, and I guess that in this panel, the invitation would be to think about innovation in innovative ways, which means to say, and I want to go back to the Incas in this conversation, because the Incas didn't really contribute any technological innovations in the Andes. Nevertheless, they were an incredibly successful, quote-unquote, empire. I don't know whether you could call it an empire. Let's say a very successful distributed confederation that was successful not because it innovated technologies. It actually just used and applied the ones that were already available from the coast of the Pacific all the way into the Amazon in these transits. They were innovative institutionally, they were innovative politically, and they were innovative economically. And I feel that right now what we need is innovation in these fields that have to do with the dark matter, maybe, of the system, more than the actual tangible desire to, through technology, solve all the world's problems. Because technology, translates into new waves of extraction. and extractivism. So I guess that this panel, as you framed it, Alan, is an invitation to think about the commons, which is this other order. When you read theories of, ancient cities, there tend to be two outlooks to interpret them. One looks at everything from the market perspective. It's all about the market. It's all about supply and demand and exchange. And that's limited. Yeah, there were markets in the Aztec world, in the Maya world. There were transaction mechanisms in the Inca world. But it doesn't explain everything, nor does the view that just focuses on the state and the hierarchy, the political hierarchy of a state-driven urbanization or development. So I feel that these two theories, whether you're looking at the ancient world through neo-Marxism or through neoliberalism, through the market-based outlook or the state-based outlook, both really fail to address this world that we see in the ground in the Amazon and throughout the tropics, actually. Because what is there is a system of, let's call it micro-ecological build-up. These were really societies that through the commons and through distributed networks of commons were building regional scale ecologies that were highly agro and biodiverse. And now that biodiversity is at stake, as it has been mentioned, and that even our own life is at stake, and the life of many other beings in this planet, I feel that we do need to go back to these lessons from the past of these microecological builders and really rethink the future from the city outward. I do strongly believe that many of the responses for the future are in the way we think about cities and in the way we will build them and construct them and reconstruct them and rethink them from now into the future. So this is an invitation to think the city through the lens of the commons and the microecologies that the commons has always constructed, in which really the architecture is a natural architecture. So with that, I would like to invite our first amazing guest speaker today, Indy Johar. Indy, I can't help noting that you are a Sikh, Punjabi Sikh, because I'm married to a Punjabi Sikh and I love the Sikhs and their gurdwaras and their philosophies. So it's a pleasure to have you here, your family to me. And he's co-founder of Dark Matters Labs and the RIBA award-winning, he runs the RIBA award-winning architecture and urban practice Architecture 00, which is, I guess, an invitation to go to ground level, zero level, and start from scratch and start from that humility of, the horizontal relationships of the commons. And he's also a founding director of Open Systems Labs. You see it WikiHow and Open Desk, so he's been working also on making digital technologies accessible to all, another commons, a commons of knowledge. And your CV is amazing, so I guess I won't read the whole thing. But I do want to also mention that you've been working a lot on sustainable urbanization, which can mean very many things from, through very many different lenses. So thank you so much for being here, Hindi, and I would invite you now to take the podium. I'll sit there and keep inviting all of you.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a pacer, so I said I wouldn't go behind the lectern. Firstly, I'm really honored to be here. I studied at Bath School of Architecture under people like Patrick Hodgkinson, and Paul Rudolph's building and the Yale building was also one of the kind of absolute kind of things we did really look at. And I never imagined I would be here, so I'm really honored to be here, and I've had the privilege of, it's my second time here, so I'm deeply honored. I want to make a bit of a, I'm going to make a particular argument, and I'm going to try to do this in 15 minutes, or 40 minutes and 15 seconds, as fast as possible. I'm not going to spend much time talking about Dark Matter Labs. You guys can check it up. We're a not-for-profit structure. We're about 75 people around the world. Highest paid to lowest paid is 2-to-1 ratio, just to give you how we're structured. We've got teams in Berlin all the way through to Vancouver to South Korea. So we're kind of run in a slightly different way. It's a little bit about how we're organized. We are organized around a series of arcs, and a series of labs, and then we work at the intersection of these things, which is all the way from radical civics, which is about sort of small-scale objects, to planetary civic objects, which are transnational objects, and we're working along the line on that side, which is on the ARC side, and on the labs, which is looking at capital systems, property, and kind of the structuring of the kind of dark matter or the deep codes of how we organize. So that's kind of a little bit just background, and underneath it are our kind of core capabilities in studios. I get into the meat of the conversation. I want to sort of pick up some of the things that were pulled out yesterday and give them a slightly different twist. And then I want to take us to a conversation which opens up why I think the commons, or the words I'm going to use are the re-entanglement of everything, is actually a fundamental, pivotal moment. And why that's changing, why that's driving a crisis into lots of our ways of seeing and operating. One, let's just start at this kind of opening position. The reality is we're almost certainly facing a 3-degree world. We keep talking about a 1.5 degree world, but if you look at the numbers and the trajectory that we're on, we're close to about 2.8 to 3.1 degrees. That's where we're likely headed. Right? That's the likelihood of where we're headed. What does that really mean? 3 degrees global average means 5 degrees land, and it means 8 degrees in urban environments. That's the trajectory. 8 degrees warmer in land. Now, these are just numbers, but remember, those aren't stable systems, so let's just note that out. UK, which sits as part of the AMOUT current and is heavily influenced by the AMOUT current, actually will end up being either significantly warmer or significantly cooler. Right? So actually the transition latitude, the transition that the UK is facing is much larger. We don't know. It'll likely warm up for a period and then radically cool down for a period. So, and what is worth noting is that this is just, what we're talking about is the total energy in the system. So it's not just heat, it's everything else, precipitation, wind, everything is becoming more energized. Then let's put this into kind of a kind of planetary context. This is between sort of 2070 at 2 to 2.5 degrees. What you start to realize is this is the locations in the world that move outside human habitable zones. Right? Now, why I want to say all this is I think there's a sort of soft presumption that we have to adapt the middle classes into a new world. And what I want to lay out here is I think what we're facing is catastrophic self-termination. Right? It's not a convenient nice to. I think what we're facing is catastrophic self-termination. If you've listened to or read the books by Professor Jim Blundell, you'll talk about the agricultural level. Since 2019, we've got a net loss of agricultural land around the world for the first time, and that's increasing as climate volatility starts to increase. So we've got food systems that are systemically under pressure. At the same time, most of the work that we see is really on what I would say is mitigation of the climate issue, and very little of financing is moving towards resilience. Whereas I would argue that we're about to see the systemic destabilization of pretty much food systems, energy systems. You can pick any one of those. They're all destabilizing. And here's the absolute kicker. We talk about, 400 million people are going to be at water risk. They will be. Unfortunately, almost certainly, we will go to violence and war far quicker than those environmental issues. And I think we're starting to see the evidence of that social breakdown and social contract destruction is happening far quicker than the environmental effects. And this was pointed to at the last IPCC report, that this was a much more systemic risk right now. So when we start to look at this, we have to start to think about the catastrophic breakdown of social structures, which is, I think, where we're more likely headed. And then we also have to understand that we often talk about climate through a temperature gradient or a precipitation gradient. But actually, it changes everything. So the UK, for example, and again, the railways in the UK run on rails that are tempered and coded for basically operating between -2 degrees and 34 degrees temperature. That's what they're coded for. As the temperature range expands, what you get is the buckling of the railways. So all of our infrastructure, whether it's rails, whether it's cables, electric cables, all of that stuff is becoming systemically more vulnerable and fragile. And so when you start to look at that, what does that fragility do? It increases volatility in the system. And what does volatility do? It starts to change actually the price points of pretty much everything. What we're starting to see is systemic volatility in the system, and that volatility is spiking prices and exacerbating inequality. And that inequality is actually thereby driving actually the societal breakdown risks. So I want to lay out that this is not a middle-class lifestyle transition we're facing right now. What we're facing is actually catastrophic risk failures and social breakdown risk failures. And I'm in the US right now, right? So you guys are seeing the counter-reactions in the system already in that framework. Next, I think it's really critical to sort of also just say that climate breakdown is a symptom, not the cause. It's a symptom of an economy which is rooted in extractionism and externalization, unpriced extractionism and unpriced externalities, which are now feedbacking into us. So what we're suffering is the feedback of that externalities, which are now feedbacking into us and increasing volatility in the system. How many people here are vegan? 1. Vegetarian. Vegan. Look, I didn't put my hands up. But if you follow the fucking numbers, what it says to you straightforwardly, actually we should all be vegan. I say this not to make a point. I say this more to make a point that even those that sit here, and I include myself in this, that understand the numbers aren't actually able to change. So we are all quasi-Trumpish, right? You know, in our day-to-day habits, let's not point to them, let's also acknowledge ourselves. And I didn't put my hand up. I didn't say I was fully vegan. But I think this is what it starts to show. And, I mean, that diagram should blow. When people talk about the Anthropocene, that is what the Anthropocene means. Wild animals, and wild plants, and wild birds are basically a zoo on the globe as a farm, right? So that is what we're talking about. That level of geoterrain that is going to have to be transitioned and shifted and is under massive systemic volatility. And this is I think we're going to see the greatest bio-re-engineering of our landscapes that we've ever seen. If you follow the numbers, pretty much all of our landscapes are going to have to migrate about 100 miles north in a very short period of time, and pretty much none of them, no evolutionary landscape migration happens at that speed. So we are now looking at a completely different world. And I sort of slightly have to start to think through the numbers and what does that really drive. This point about price volatility, I think this is super important because what we're seeing, I mean, I was in the US, I'm being shocked by the price of food, just food, right? What you're seeing is price volatility is massively driving inequality, and it's going to increase as climate breakdown increases volatility in the system and non-predictability in the system. And that's what we're starting to see at every micro level. Climate breakdown, loss of predictability. Loss of predictability means actually price volatility. It also means a whole lot of other things about loss of insurability, loss of capital markets, right? That loop is a foundational loop of how we organize and capitalize and invest into the world. It is breaking down at the systemic level. And then the next part, which I think is really important, is thinking through the landscape of constraints. We as a civilization, and I include myself in the story, as a civilization have operated beyond the theory of constraints. We have used technology as a mantra to basically ignore the theory of constraints. What is very evident right now is that we are operating in a new landscape of constraints, and those constraints aren't just straightforward. Yes, carbon. When I say carbon is a constraint, we saw the hints at it yesterday. The reality is all of Europe can afford to build 144,000 homes a year. All of Europe. The UK alone is looking to build 350,000 homes. That's under current modalities of production. Now, I get, we're all fans of the transition, we're all architects, but the reality is we don't have the timber supply. We don't have the timber supply to anywhere close match that demand. So when you start to look at the fundamental numbers, and yes, in certain locations you can do certain things, but if you look at a macro level, it doesn't work. And if you look at current timber supply, I know this was contested information by the World Resources Institute, but basically they said if you're using existing global flows of timber, you're basically 5% variant from concrete in terms of total embodied carbon. Right? So it is a massive transformation that we're in the middle of that requires that. Now, material supply, climate breakdown I've already listed, labor supply. labor supply, and what I would add is cognition capacity. This transition requires a level of complex cognition and decision-making at pretty much every aspect of our lives. Talked about the food systems, you talk about the foundations, they're all being transformed, and they're going to have to be transformed. I think we're under-discussing the cognitive capacity of societies to compute, and I use the word compute, these decisions and changes. That is a massive load which is under-factored into our institutions. Yale, world's best institution. How much are we able to move as fast as possible? So there's a cognitive load that our institutions aren't designed for, and the deglobalization which we're into, there's a whole conversation about multipolarity and the loss of global commodity markets, and that's happening in food systems, that's happening everywhere. India banned the exports of rice. You're starting to see products, key foundational products now becoming what I would call geopolitical assets as opposed to global commodities. That is going to increase price volatility. Now, as we start to map into this, I want to sort of just quickly start to example out some of these constraint landscapes. So this is based on the work we're doing in Denmark. What you start to see is how do you start to do these material and sort of carbon transitions? Currently, what Denmark current emissions were, sort of targets were 9.6. The average was 9.6 kilograms per meter squared per year. This is kind of annual, but annual cycle. Danish law in 2024 brought that down to 7.1. They've got to get to 0.4 by 2029. Right? 0.4. 2029 is 5 years. The best schemes are at 3.6, I think. And those are the best schemes. We are factor folds away from the scale of the transformation that's required. And when you start to follow the numbers, what you start to see is actually requiring really different strategies. And this is where I think architecture becomes really important. I don't think the future is available to us currently. Maybe in 40 years when we've rebuilt a biomaterial landscape, we've re-engineered some of those other supply chains. In the short term, we're going to have different architectural strategies of response. They're going to have to be about changing the typologies of investment. So how do we start to think about the house as utilization rates? How do we think about transforming our theory of comfort? How much comfort needs to be provided at the house level, at the material level? How much comfort is provided in different formats? What's the nature of comfort? Material innovation, which you're seeing lots of, all the way to radical sharing. We're going to have to share our materials in radically new ways. And that's not just about the reuse, it's also about where we invest our limited materials. More and more the conversations we're having in a place like Denmark is you want to put shared kitchens in at the street level, you want to put shared facilities in at the street level, and actually release material spaces in every house level rather than trying to build additional rooms in people's houses. So what does that do in terms of intergenerational living? Why does intergenerational living become really critical? Because actually all sorts of care costs, which many of these societies are starting to hit. So when you start to look at this all the way through to ecological services, that changes architectural strategies quite fundamentally. And the space, the intervention landscape. I want to put these numbers up there because it blew my mind when we were sort of compiling the research. Just like what we're really talking about. When you talked about ram earth, you get to 7 kilograms per meter squared, right? Like that's rammed earth. Hemp walkery, that's where you get to somewhere like a negative carbon. Like, the numbers are ridiculous because what they start to show us that most of our strategies are out of date. And I think there's no product replacement strategy. We won't go from a house to a house. Not yet. This was mentioned yesterday, like, I think we've lost the timescale for even retrofit. We don't have the carbon volcano that we'd have to release into the air to pull back from in time. This was one of the best houses, 125 kilograms per meter squared of carbon. Would take 21 years to get to net zero. We just don't have that. Like Eva was saying, we've hit carbon budgets already in different environments, like Amsterdam, Holland, Denmark. They've already exceeded their carbon budgets in many formats. So that's kind of the big picture, and I just want to sort of lay that landscape out. One thing I would say is I think this is almost a fundamental transformation. Energy, biointegrity, all the way from human development, which I think Jonathan Rose will talk about, like what is a human development framework, all the way through our material economy, which is in all the different, we're going to have to radically reduce our material economy and move towards an intangibles economy. This is as close to an industrial revolution of that order of magnitude that will change all of our environments around us. And it requires new ways of operating at the kind of supply and demand management side. We're going to have to operate in both supply and demand. And this was again hinted at beautifully about the forest to timber thinking. It's no longer about optimizing the house. It's about optimizing the relationship between ecological systems. And that requires us to design in fundamentally different ways. Again, this is work that we're doing on how do you construct these multi-party systems and multi-party organism capabilities. Again, I could go on about this. But also this opens up radical new pathways of how we govern materials. So one of the organizations we're working with talks about they're looking at clothes, and they're saying, how do we put the clothes as a community asset? There's no longer a consumer relationship to a producer relationship. The clothes are a community asset. They're a material commonly owned asset. This new types of institutions are becoming absolutely critical to manage completely different theories of material governance. This was for electric batteries, looking at how do you put electric batteries outside producer-consumer relationships into common goods and replacement scenarios. And that is where technology is changing the theory of how we govern actually commons in complex emergent ways. So the material economy is open to pretty radical transformation. That, to me, opens up this conversation around infrastructure. I think one of the challenges we're seeing is I pretty much believe the next round of major investments in place are going to be around critical infrastructures. Trees as infrastructures, care capacity of a city's infrastructure, the collective intelligence of a city, the collective reasoning capacity of a city. These aggregative population-level investments, which drive the capacity at a population scale to drive transformation, those are the things that allow us to basically navigate this transformation in radical ways. And those are really key parts of it. Already mentioned before, around multi-solving issues. I'm going to jump through a few slides because I'm conscious of time, but I think we have to do multi-point solving for every investment we make. So a house is not a house. House is a pollinator. House is a multi-species steward. House is a generator of clean air. House is a generator of clean energy. A house is a human development environment. And the house is not even a house because it's a multi-optimizing habitation. So our typologies, our theories of functional organization of the city are end of cycle. That requires a reclassification of how we organize at fundamental levels. And that changes everything, right? So the reason why, for example, urban trees are 97% of urban trees planted are male because they're lower maintenance cost, right? That's why. But because they're all male, unfortunately, it's the cheapest for the maintenance department, but they increase asthma levels throughout the city because actually they produce high levels of pollen. So what you start to see is, unless you start to multi-optimize, you designing badly. We're designing for single functional optimization. That requires a fundamental shift in how we design and operate. I can keep going, and there's a few things I'm just going to make points of. The complexity of what we're dealing with. This is just literally about how to build a comfort contract between a house. So changing the theory of energy supply to theories of comfort, that requires a whole vest of system-level transformations at the code level that require transformation. That to me, in order to change that's a new type of architecture production in order to change those relationships. And also new types of agreement spaces. We're working a lot at the city scale. How do you do mass multi-actor agreement spaces? Because if you're going to preserve democracy, we're going to have to preserve a pathway for multiple actors to come to an agreement in a radical new way, which isn't rooted just in representation. Representation is one means of agreement. What are other means of agreement and other forms of agreement in that pathway? So my number one message is, in this moment, what you start to think about is a re-entanglement. What we're seeing, whether it's the house or whether it's your phone, everything is becoming re-entangled. The idea of property ownership, idea of the divisibility, idea of separation, objecthood, the thesis of the last 400 years, which has constructed our worldview, separation, perspective, objectification, classification theory, these logics are all breaking down. And our problem space is that we are now re-entangling, and we're still viewing the world from the idea of objects. And this is, I think, the political war we're in the middle of. This is the core root ideological war we're in the middle of. The re-entanglement is manifest, and it's destroying my theory of freedom, because my theory of freedom is industrial theory of freedom. And unless we reconcile that is the political conversation. That is the deep politics of this transformation. I'm really apologize for running over. Sorry. I want to say why this. So if as a hypothesis, this deep re-entanglement is the issue, then I think what we have to talk about is a much deeper transformation. And that deeper transformation is already being hinted at, right? So what we're talking about is fundamentally a transformation in our relationship with the world. And you've got hints of this happening throughout the world. They are built on actually rhyming with the past and rhyming with historic ways of relating to the world around us, whether it's indigenous models and other models that are being born. And there is no coincidence that we're rhyming, because in complexity, what you have to organize is not through power over, but power with models. In complexity, in systems orientation, you have to shift your theory of organizing that recognizes the agenthood of everything. And that changes pretty much everything. We're moving from a power over world, a world rooted in theories of dominion, to a world in relationship with. And that in that is a fundamental transformation. And I think every architectural revolution has been rooted in a reimagination of what it means to be human. And I would argue the fundamental transformation is the same. It is a reimagination of what it means to be human. Because in this moment, actually we are no longer talking about our divisibility. We're no longer talking, my brain is a social brain. I stand on the shoulders of thousands of people. And it is the recognition, the microbiomes. We are all sharing microbiomes in this space. It's sharing that actually epigenetics have significant impacts of actually longitudinally in time, significant impacts of how I behave and how I operate in society. When we start to re-entangle the human, and we're not divisible beings, we start to also re-entangle the world around us. And in that opens up massive ideas of fundamental ideas. What is freedom in an age of entanglements? What is our thesis in our relationship? Is it a freedom of consumption, or is it a freedom to be radically human? The pronoun wars we're in the middle of, actually, it is more accurate to say we are all we, they, them, because you are all a multitude. We are all a multitude, both in personalities, both in terms of actually the microbiomes and how our bodies are physically organized, right? So scientifically, it's much more truthful. And I would argue that this is the scale of the transformation. So what I wanted to root out in this conversation is this conversation about the commons and why the commons has come back. Right? It is not a romance of 19th century ideas of commons. This is not that commons. It is not a lake that we're talking about. It is the re-entanglement of everything. And that is a worldview shift, and that is the war we're in the middle of, because I think people do not feel safe in the loss of the re-entanglement in fundamental formats. And with that, I sincerely apologize. I have taken 8 minutes longer. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
I'll invite you to sit here. Thank you so much. That was incredible, Hindi. And I love the last two images that you showed, because we've been living in a world of 8,000 years of hierarchical civilizations that have perpetually destroyed the commons. And right now we're living in an era of heterarchical, emerging civilizations that are very different and work with very different logics that will finally re-vindicate the commons, because it's probably the only way out, the distributed network versus the hierarchical pyramid. But thank you, that was very, very stimulating. And now we have another wonderful guest speaker who's going to be responding to Hindi's provocation, so to speak, Sarah Kubing. She's the founding director of the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program. I'm looking forward to learning more about that. And what's very interesting about Sarah's work is that basically she's trying to re-entangle science with policy making, with economy, with, a network of actors that can start breaking the boundaries or the separations within knowledge systems, and to re-entangle them so that we can act together in unison. So that's wonderful what you're doing. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Indy. I really actually appreciate the length and some of the setup that you did, because I think I'm going to hit on some of the same themes as I was listening to Indy, I think there's a clear, in all the panels yesterday, vulnerability that our current economic systems have set up for us, our current social systems, our current structure, and how we view comfort in our interactions with the relationship. And I think part of my response, which I don't have up here, but I think is important to note, is we use these. I'm a forest ecologist by training, and so I'm going to stand up here today to tell you just a little bit of a perspective of what I think Western science and Western forest ecosystem science can tell us about the ecosystems in which we want to live within and also use materials from. But I want to talk about something called a vulnerability discourse, because it's something that ecologists fall into all the time, where we talk about nature as this very fragile, like vulnerable thing that we have to take care of. And this is not to say that we do not need to think about how we steward our environment and that we, can do whatever we want. But at the same time, I hope that maybe perhaps some of the things I say will resonate, and that ecosystems are actually quite strong. They're actually quite resilient. And humans, especially today's humans in our extractive ways, have done a lot of damage, but they are not vulnerable as ecosystems. And so I hope that gives like a little bit of hope punk to the room, that we do have this sort of ability to work with ecosystems in a way that can make them rich, along with our cultures and our peoples. I'm going to talk today a little bit about synthesizing science for policy and decision making, because that is the goal of the center I run. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but my goal is to say, as managers and policymakers, what information do you need about ecosystems, and how can I give you that information in a way that you can make an informed decision about what your actions are? But I want to start by just saying that science doesn't tell us the answer, and that is something I remind the students all the time. What we can do as scientists, especially in this space when we're trying to re-envision what our future can look like, we can project based on the knowledge that we have and the data we have what is going to happen. But policy, or what people want, really needs to direct, right? So what do I mean by that? So let's say I can give you a science projection. Here's 3 different habitats. An old field on the right, that's a pretty typical habitat that you could find anywhere here in New England. If we didn't do anything to that, if we didn't mow it or burn it every couple years, it would eventually revert back to a forested ecosystem. We have young forests that have been harvested in the last 50 years with a lot of tiny, small, slimmer trees. We have mature forests that have some bigger trees and have some structural diversity. I could project, as a scientist, what species of wildlife or plants that you might find in those habitats. But what I can't tell you as a scientist is, what do you want in your state? What do you want in your habitat? And so this is just a really nice figure that is going along from our open fields. Do you like killdeer and bluebirds? Do you like walking in those areas? Do you like migratory yellow warblers and to provide habitat for these seasonal migrants? Or do you like wood thrush and bats and flying squirrels? Very cute. We cannot have a single ecosystem with all of these species. We can have a matrix of ecosystems. But so as a scientist, I can tell you perhaps how many wood thrush you could have per acre of forest within your state. But the people in Connecticut, or the people running the Department of Environmental Protection, are going to be the people who say, this is how many wood thrush we would like to have relative to killdeer or bluebirds or yellow warblers. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember as we look towards forest scientists in thinking about material supplies and uses of ecosystems. The other thing that Indy's ownership model set up really nicely, we have a fallacy that is still rife today, but another thing I would love for folks to walk out of this room is knowing there is no balance of nature. Despite what you could read in a New York Times headline, there is no balance in nature and there is no linearity in nature. And so that ownership model that Indy showed with man on top and everything else flowing below, we can trace those lines of thinking back to Aristotle. When Aristotle was writing about the taxonomy of organisms and animals, a very linear flow from God to man, to whatever they considered higher beings, to potentially the little tiny insects, which we actually know, microbes, that rule the world, but are down at the bottom of that linear complex. And so we really need to remember that there's no balance or right way. And why, down, Alan told me down is forward. Why is there no balance? It's because these ecosystems and these species are constantly changing. They're constantly transforming. Let's see if this will work. No lizards were harmed in the making of this video. A friend and colleague of mine who completed his PhD here at Yale right after he left was studying these anole lizards that you can see here on the left in Turks and Caicos. And he was measuring, he was catching lizards. He was a herpetologist. He loves to catch lizards. And one of the things that he was measuring on the lizards was the size of the little sticky things on the bottom of their feet. And while Colin and his colleagues were out sampling lizards, 2 successive hurricanes came through the Turks and Caicos, Irma and Maria. And when Colin went out to sample a few days after Maria hit, he found a really surprising discovery. The only lizards that he could find had much noticeably larger sticky pads on the bottom of their feet. And he hypothesized and then tested by putting these poor lizards through these wind tunnels that those sticky pads were actually, the lizards with the bigger sticky pads were able to hold on to the trees or the surfaces much better than the ones that did not, that had tiny sticky pads. So in the course of a hurricane, he tracked evolution in time. And so species are constantly evolving, and we never know what, I know this guy, he finally didn't make it. But he wasn't hurt, I promise. I talked to Colin about this. So species are constantly evolving. They're constantly changing. And so now the Turks and Caicos lizards have bigger sticky pads, but there might be a trade-off. That might change. There might be other things that are good about having smaller sticky pads on the bottom of your feet, but species evolve. They have that adaptive capacity. Ecosystems are also transforming all the time, with or without humans. So there's always dynamism. And this diagram that you just saw before, we would call that in a plant ecology class, this is succession. And it does give this idea of linearity of, you go from your field and you get some small scrubs and shrubs, you go to young forest, you go to big forest. But that is not actually what we see on the landscape. We see ecosystems moving all the time, resetting and going back. And that is because, there we go. Disturbances are really common in our ecosystems. Human-made disturbances like harvesting forest, obviously, but also lots of natural disturbances. And the rate and the change and the severity of those disturbances are always changing through time. So this is a picture of a windstorm, of a blowdown that hit an area in western Pennsylvania where I don't know if you can see, but all these trees were toppled and snapped off. And we had these large, giant openings within this forested ecosystem that now was bringing tons of light into the forested ecosystem that was going to allow for a whole different suite of species that you wouldn't find in a dense, dark forest because of those changes in environmental conditions. We also have pest pathogens and diseases that are taking a toll, both a toll in when we bring in new ones, but also lots of different pests and pathogens that we have. And this here is maybe not clear, but this is one of the most remarkable things that's ever happened to me walking in the woods in Connecticut during a spongy moth outbreak. So all of these little critters that you can see, these are all caterpillars that were climbing and crawling up the trees. And this was a photo taken in mid-July where I should not have been able to see blue sky when I took that photo, but there were so many caterpillars in this forest that it looked like early spring because they had chewed off so many of the leaves. And the undergrad I had out with me in the time in the forest was really grossed out, but you could actually hear the caterpillar poop raining down onto the forest. So, yeah. And when I told the undergrad, they were like, no, thank you. This is not what I am going to be doing with my life. But these disturbances happen all the time. And when they happen in small bits and pieces, we get these dynamics matrices and changes within our forest. Okay, so if we know all of this, then what I guess I really want to say is there's no singular right way to manage an ecosystem. There's no one right way, and if anyone tells you that there's one right way, they're telling you based on some decision that they have made about some outcome that they personally want to see, and so you should dig into that. What I can say is that some ways that we manage our ecosystems will be more likely to meet specific policy goals. And so what do I mean by that? Well, in a recent paper that we are looking at different ways of harvesting forested ecosystems here in southern New England, there's a lot of controversy about what we should be doing, especially as we think about harvesting or not harvesting forests for wood production or things like carbon storage for climate mitigation. And a lot of people will pull numbers. And so what I just want to show you here is that depending on what your priorities are or what the policy priorities are, you might pick different management outcomes. And so what we did was we modeled forest growth, looking at forests of today where we didn't harvest any wood, we just let them sit. That is definitely something that there are a lot of people who would say we need to do. We looked at a type of harvest that I'm going to call exploitation harvest. It's basically taking the highest quality, highest value wood every 25 to 30, or trees, sorry, every 25 to 30 years in an exploitative manner. This is pretty traditional of what we see when harvest happens here in southern New England. Or we can look at something called regenerative harvest, which is both removing trees, but in a way that will promote regeneration of that forest back to a more diverse forest. And that's a type of silvicultural practice that we teach here at the Forest School, at the Yale School of the Environment, where you leave some standing mature trees in your forest to both provide seed, but also protection to regenerate that forest back and to grow it back. And so if we have these three different ways of harvesting, we can then project out, well, what are some things that we might see in the future under some assumed things? And so we can look and we can see that something like regenerative harvest after 25 years gives us the highest amount of tree diversity. So the way you can read these spider plots is each of these circles represent sort of the maximum value that we found within our study. And so we can see here after 25 years, tree diversity is actually the highest in our regenerative harvest plots relative to our no harvest or our exploitation harvest plots. But we also see that we get better structural diversity. That's the difference in the size of the trees that we have in our forest or the height of the trees in our forest. And generally, we know as a maxim in ecology that the more diverse a forest is in its size, in its structure, in its species, the more different habitat it provides for other organisms. We also know that things change as it goes out through time. And so we see a different picture if we try to model out to 100 years afterwards, where we start seeing that some of that tree diversity decreases, and where we go. So you can stare at this and look at this, but I think it's really important because what I really try to say when I bring this science forward into ecology-related discussions on what we should be doing, I really try to focus it back on, well, what do we want? What do we need? Because there's always going to be trade-offs. But with that, I will leave it because I am a little over, and I will hand it back to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. And yes, it brings a little bit of optimism. You know, nature is strong, not vulnerable, and will prevail ultimately. And I'm glad that you're working with silvicultural systems here at the Yale School of the Environment. That's great news as well. So we have our next guest speaker is a very good friend of many of us here in the room. Vijayanti Rao is an anthropologist, but she works at the intersection of anthropology, art, habitat, and she has been focusing her work on quote-unquote informal areas, both within the quote-unquote global south and the global north, you know, these archipelagos of informality that exist as well in the high-income countries. So thank you so much, Vijayanti, for being here.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Alan, for including me in this on this panel. And particularly, I'm grateful to be on this panel because there's a lot of diversity in it. And one of the things I've taken up residence in the School of Architecture as an anthropologist, and we are really one of the things that we're concerned with is diversity, and diversity in like systemic diversity, which Sarah ended her talk with. So I am now going to switch gears and and become very human-centric for a change. I'm going to speak from the Indian experience, which is where I've had my most research experience, and trace, I'm going to tell a story really of quite a complicated situation, then trying to trace the history of attempts to change the informal housing systems that are found across most of the global south. Particularly in the story is really being told from the perspective of Mumbai, and it's taken me a good number of decades, though I grew up in the city and have spent a lot of time there. It took me a lot of time to unravel and produce a kind of a linear narrative, which is not exactly not how things go anyway. So the story begins in Mumbai in the mid-1990s. This was just after the economic liberalization of India. Foreign capital was flooding into the country and space was in high demand, particularly in the large metropolitan regions like Mumbai. Employment opportunities had soared and jobs were concentrated both in the high-skilled service sectors as well as on the low end in sweatshop manufacturing and so forth. The population of Mumbai, which had begun to swell already in the 1970s, was now more than double, with an estimated 5,000 people arriving in the city every day. Housing demand had outstripped supply, of course, and like the United States deficit, the gap was unlikely to be closed without drastic measures to build, and particularly to build at speed. However, the planning regulations that had been in place since the 1960s severely curbed the amount of buildable space, leading to the dramatic growth of informal settlements. I'm just scrolling through some images of Mumbai, but these, by informal settlements, there's a wide range. There's settlements that are extremely precarious, like this one, and there's settlements like this one. So there's a lot of variation, and I would say even settlements, building typologies like this one that you see, which have been kind of accumulating over the decades in the city of Mumbai. So these informal settlements had developed mainly in the edge conditions, using large-scale land-filling techniques to extend the city's landmass. The formal housing market, also constrained by the same conditions, could not respond with similar development strategies without policy changes. In the mid-1990s, new development regulations were sanctioned to bypass existing curbs in development, creating certain loopholes that allowed for new market rate developments to be tied to slum redevelopment. And this picture kind of dramatizes that process of redevelopment, where so there's basically these loopholes which were tied to redeveloping housing stock that was in very poor condition, was connected with actually just giving away, almost gifting away land to developers in order to construct what you see in the background, these high-rise towers, which were essentially for sale housing. This is very similar, actually, to the process, to some of the policies adopted in New York City, for example, especially under Bloomberg and de Blasio and going forward. Essentially, these loopholes entail the creation of development rights in the form of air rights through legal instruments, allowing for the dramatic physical transformation of Mumbai from a low-rise city to a high-rise one. And these are some images of that transition as it has been taking place over the decades. The idea was for developers to create standardized housing units to resettle slum dwellers in exchange for access to the land occupied by informal settlements, which were often located centrally in highly desirable neighborhoods and close to transportation networks. The resettlement housing provided to eligible residents eligibility involving proof of domicile in Mumbai before the 1995 cutoff date was sometimes at the same location and sometimes involved moving far out into the urban periphery. And these are some of the peripheral housing estates that developed during the last 20 years. These standardized units introduced elevators and piped water, altering building forms, maintenance and repair costs, as well as lifestyles. As expected, there were problems of attrition due to higher maintenance costs demanded at regular intervals as opposed to incremental financial investments. The poor quality of this new building stock and new development norms essentially resulted in the production of vertical slums, which are now found across Mumbai, further weaponizing air rights to create conditions that maintain the class divide. The building is not just a building, as Indy has said. Its form and architecture, its relation, and the relationships it facilitates have become a legal instrument for the spread of disease such as tuberculosis due to lowered ventilation standards and the dramatic rise of India's carbon footprint. This Mumbai model has been adopted widely across India, creating a booming real estate market for both the highest and the lowest quality of housing. Architects had a very minor role to play in this burgeoning building culture. Housing activism, on the other hand, was quite strong. And in the early 21st century, basically there were two approaches that emerged. The first was to facilitate end on this slide, which shows the sort of Mumbai close to what it is now, from what you saw in the very first image, which was an image from the 19th century, from the city, from precincts that were developed in the 18th century. So housing activism took two approaches, basically. The first was to facilitate the movement of people from informal housing into standardized units of the type that I showed earlier, which the units in these buildings are of 225 square feet, which were provided by developers. And the second tactic was to promote in situ development or development by the people living in these informal settlements. The story of one organization called SPARK, which stands for Society for the Promotion of Area Resources Center, whose model was to create networks of housing rights activists across India and across the globe, actually, exemplifies certain broad transitions in what I would call building cultures in the global south. SPARK, which was founded by a group of social workers, former government bureaucrats, and housing rights activists, as well as people who lived in these neighborhoods, was an exemplary civil society organization in that it brought together a coalition of groups to solve the housing crisis. The focus was multi-pronged, and the collaborative nature of the work ensured that the NGO's target beneficiaries were always part of the negotiations with the government, and they were training themselves for new lifestyles facilitated by the transition to new built forms. Again, the building is not just an architectural object, but an ecology of economic, social, political, and environmental relationships. Other activists, such as who were agitated for land rights and the rights to remain in places that these informal settlers had painstakingly developed at great cost over decades. The ironic effect of these new development regulations was that rather than decreasing this proliferation of informal settlements, they actually increased. These sorts of spaces began to proliferate even more, particularly in the case of Mumbai, as successive elected governments promised more and more free resettlement housing to eligible residents. The cultures around construction, using local materials and surplus discarded by the construction industry, already well developed, continued to flourish. During the current decade, as it has become clear that the development paradigm involving slum resettlement housing has not only failed, but created new environmental problems, the focus has shifted for NGOs like Spark from facilitating the movement from housing, informal housing to formal housing, to developing affordable and environmentally responsive housing, most of it in situ. The founders of Spark have pivoted to face the realities of climate change, establishing a new organization called Roof Over Our Heads. Specifically concerned with developing housing that keeps pace with the realities of climate change, I view their work as a practical step towards decolonizing design, moving beyond the celebration of local ingenuity and survival tactics to engage trained architects and environmental scientists in the co-production of solutions. This group uses deeply entrenched relations within the community from their past development work, particularly the Mahila Milan Network or the women's savings groups promoted for decades by Spark. And building on that trust, they work with families to understand the microeconomics within which they live and work, their life stories, and their aspirations. In just 2 years, Ruh has developed community labs in 9 Indian cities, chosen for the depth of their networks and the differences in microclimates. The idea, of course, is that one size does not fit all, and that solutions must be worked out painstakingly at micro-local levels. And now these slides are all going to be showing the work of Ruh in in the case of one house. And I'm not going to sort of read out what they have achieved, but this is a demonstration, what they call a demonstration house. They've just begun to construct these houses, and the process of constructing even a single demonstration house takes more than a year of conversation, negotiation, understanding the aspirations of the families, and also understanding their economic capacities and capabilities. But what is clear from the research, which is actually published and publicly available, is that they have dramatically kind of been able to show that with very low cost interventions, they're able to change the living conditions for families such as the ones that they are collaborating with and working with. And from my interviews with the people who are doing this work on the ground, it's also clear that every single house has to be individually negotiated, because there is no in terms of financing in particular, there's a very wide range of family finances that are operating in even a single informal settlement. So there's absolutely no homogeneity. And this, in a sense, is maybe one of the obstacles to this kind of work. But these new practices that are hybrid and inclusive of community-based experts and professionally trained architects and engineers have the capacity to produce not just local change, but the transformation of the very culture of building and construction, precisely because they are responsive to constraints at multiple levels and multiple scales, from the scale of household finances and composition to the planetary scale. So the efforts to decolonize design must incorporate all of these scales if they are to succeed. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Via. In 2011, I visited Dharavi with Sheila Patel, and it's so nice to see an update on what the wonderful work they are still doing today. Super, super interesting. Thank you so much for that. Considering that a large portion of the world is semi-spontaneous or spontaneous urbanization, this is absolutely critical to our future conversations. And last but not least, we have our last wonderful speaker, Chandra Robinson, who is a principal at Liber Architecture in Portland. You came all the way from Portland to be with us today. Thank you so much for that. And Chandra has been working mainly with cultural, educational facilities, co-designing them with communities, and really thinking about culture and the role that it can play in architecture. It's fantastic to have you here. Thank you for having come all the way.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. We've gone from really big scale to the scale of a single person's home, and I'm going to talk about a few projects that we've worked on at Lever that take a few different strategies and kind of leverage those to improve what we're doing and to involve communities. So a few of these projects here, these are the ones that I'm going to share with you that have some aspect of regeneration of for these projects. And so Meyer Memorial Trust, that's an office building. The Nature Conservancy is an office building, and these two have sort of the beginnings of the sustainable wood sourcing kind of push that's happening in Portland right now. And then we have some projects that have some great aspects of tribal sourcing for the wood that's going into these projects. And then we also do some work that is testing and building buildings for the testing. So, you know, there's a tall wood kind of consortium where we're, you know, testing a rocking wall for seismic resilience. We're also working on, you know, an acoustic testing lab, a fire testing lab, a CLT factory. So a lot of these different things, you know, we're doing research in these areas, but it's all through the practice that we do. So the first project, Meyer Memorial Trust, it is the headquarters for a foundation that provides grants just in Oregon to improve Oregonians' lives, and they focus on equity and sustainability, innovation, education. And so they wanted a place that was really representative of their values. And so what we did was kind of work with them and say, here are some innovative sort of materials that are coming out of Oregon. This is one of those. It's mass plywood, so it's something very familiar to people, but it is sort of a new way of doing that so that it can span really far. And one of the great things about this is that it's an industrial material, so you can make a space that's very nice, but it also feels really humble because it's not something super polished. You can see the grain of the wood. You can understand exactly what that material is, which is great for a foundation, right? So in thinking about this building, it was thinking about materials like that. It was also kind of the basics of thinking about how do we change the form of the building to improve its sustainable aspects. So a flat roof going up to a pitched roof and then kind of angling those pitches to get optimized solar angles on those. But then it was also the really big part of this project was creating a definition, creating criteria for sustainable wood sourcing that we could use on this project specifically. So based on the client's values, again, equity and sustainability and innovation and education, number one for their sustainable wood sourcing was that these things could come from minority and women-owned businesses, tribal enterprises, and specifically for tribal enterprises, we're not asking for any certifications there. We're understanding that these owned and managed forests that are run by indigenous communities are already doing great things for their lands, right? They are stewards of the land in the biggest way. And so if we couldn't find any of those, then we would say, okay, third-party certification, because we don't know anything about how some other products were managed in their forests and who was actually, you know, in the mill and who was in the manufacturing plant and who brought it to the site. So we said FSC, SFI, other kinds of third-party certification. If none of those were available, then we said the product should come from Oregon first, because that's where we are, the Pacific Northwest second, and third, Pacific Northwest including Canada, because the forest is the forest. And, you know, third would be just within the United States, so not outside of the country, even though there are a lot of wood products that come from outside of the country. So really, this was thinking about creating a definition that was meaningful to the client and that was also meaningful to the state of Oregon, putting money back in rural communities. And so by doing that, we were able to say, okay, well, there's only a 3% premium on all of this to have 85% of the wood products be sustainable wood by our definition, right? And so, you know, half of that was FSC, and it also allowed us to engage a lot of minority-owned businesses and small businesses on this. And so if there was a product that was, say, 15% or less premium, we would go ahead and take it. And if it was more than that, then we would have a conversation with the client about which one of these things would help them tell their story more, which was more important to them. And so it was a really specific kind of process with that client. And so for not very much money, we were able to keep all of the wood sourcing in a really small area. And, we traded out different products. We found, oh, you're using this kind of ceiling. Well, there's one that's actually made in Oregon City. Let's choose that, obviously, because that's an option. And so that was a way for us to be able to not only engage smaller businesses and be able to leverage the great sustainable practices of indigenous communities, but also to then put money back, the circular economy, put money back into our own rural communities. The Nature Conservancy is a building in Oregon, and this was a rehab of a building, and the sort of small part that you see on there is a pavilion. That was the new addition onto it. And the Nature Conservancy, they acquire land and they do restoration projects on it. And so again, for them, sustainability was important. And we started off by saying, okay, great, well, what can we do? What are you doing out there that we can kind of lock into? One of those things, obviously, we chose one of the first uses of FSC certified CLT for this pavilion. But what's really more important is that the building itself represents a lot of the different ecosystems that are in the lands that they are actively protecting. So the big idea here was to say, great, we're representing them, but also, can we do a restoration project based around this project? So what you're seeing here is called the Sagebrush Sea, the Sageland Sea. So across the United States, a lot of this sort of area, really beautiful. This is in Oregon. And within that ecosystem, there are juniper trees, and those are native to Oregon, but they have overgrown because of fire suppression and other forest management practices over time. So instead of looking like that, they look like this, right? So this is a very young stand of juniper trees. And there are about 350 different species of animals that rely on a well-managed, healthy sagebrush land, including the really cool greater sage grouse that has this awesome mating dance that I love so much. But so instead of, looking like this, we look like this. And in taking taking this juniper and kind of finding a use for it, finding a market for it, when you extract all of those trees, you're actually able to save 750,000 gallons of water a year in that specific valley when you're taking from that valley. And a lot of times what the sort of restoration process is that farmers will cut down the juniper trees, but then more juniper trees just grow under it because they're not taking it away. So this was, one step further on that, take the trees away, make an exterior cladding. So all of the building is clad in this juniper, which was really exciting because it was something that was, benefiting an ecosystem, but was also very much about what the client was looking for. Portland State University is an art and design school in Portland, Oregon. One side of it is on a busy street and the main street through downtown Portland. The other side of it is on the park blocks, a really beautiful park. And it's right next to the Native American Student Cultural Center, which has a center for indigenous technical ecological knowledge in it. So they hold a lot of classes and they're right next door. With this building, we were actually, because we were exposing so much of the structure, because it was wood, we were actually able to get 70% of the wood in the project from indigenous owned and managed land. So the Yakima and the Umpqua tribes have all of these lands and were able to provide a lot of wood. And you're seeing these interiors, right? There's regular plywood, there's CLT, there's glue lambs, all of these things. But really the idea is more about where did we get it from, who managed the forest, who actually harvested it, who ran it through the mill, and who turned it into an actual product. And so understanding each of those steps throughout the process was really important to us because we wanted to make sure that we were actually doing something good in the community. Because this is extractive, you are taking out these trees, but through indigenous practices, it's well, I'm going to share that actually in the next project. So the 70% of the wood package, that was $500,000, came from this Yakima and Umpqua forests. And their purpose for these forests really is to grow their community and provide places for the community to kind of be at home, to advance tribal knowledge and kind of share that, to conserve these forests, and also to create jobs within their community. So the Portland Museum of Art is not Portland, Oregon, it's Portland, Maine, so it's on this side of the country. And this is a project that's the expansion and unification of a museum. And, for a lot of folks, museums are not a place that's comfortable. You'll see on one side, the brick building is the existing building, Payson building, really beautiful for architects to look at. It's super cool. But when you look at it, you can't see through it. You can't see inside of it. You don't know what's happening in there. And if you are not a person who has gone to museums or goes there regularly, you don't really know what's going to happen inside, and you might not feel comfortable walking into a total surprise, right? Typically, when you walk into a museum, there's a security guard right there and then a ticket booth, and it's all about prove that you are supposed to be here by giving us money and, looking really nice and not ruffling any feathers and being quiet. And so they really wanted something opposite. So you see the expansion on one side is as transparent as can possibly be so that people feel comfortable. They can see in, they understand what's happening. They see natural materials, they see a lot of light in that space, and they can say, well, maybe this is for me, and I will kind of walk in and see what's inside. But the ideas for this building really came from our collaboration with an indigenous advisor. So we worked with Chris Newell, and he's from the Wabanaki tribe. And these next images are not of Chris, but really talks about their worldview. So, having all these one-on-ones with Chris and kind of talking about what's important to those folks as indigenous people. They are called the people of the Dawnland, and it's their privilege and their responsibility to sing and to welcome the sun as it rises every day over the continent, because Maine kind of sticks way out. So, their 12,000 years of history in Maine is about them every day greeting the sun and encouraging it to come back again the next day. And that's really, really beautiful. So they have these ceremonies in different places and, sometimes right on the coast. And they've actually become really famous. There's some recordings of the singing that you can hear, especially in the Portland Museum of Art. But so thinking about how connected they are to the land and to the sun and to their position in the world, it was really important to think about, how can we connect back to the land in a meaningful way? For the Wabanaki people, all the elements of the earth are beings. So the rocks are beings, the trees are beings. And when those get harvested, they will go back into the forest. Not us, not the architects, not people who are not Wabanaki, but those folks after a harvest will go in and just thank the forest for those individual trees that have been taken because they're beings. But it also means that inside of the building, that life is actually reflected to them. They understand that these are beings. So how do we treat the materials once we're inside the building is actually really important. This is about the form of the building. So because that celestial alignment is really important, the floor plan of the building really aligns with the angle of the winter solstice sun, so that that light kind of cuts through the entire building. And being able to see through a building, wayfinding is really important for people's comfort. And then the gentle curve of the roof appears to cradle the sun at the summer solstice. And so, when we're talking about bringing in cultural aspects into the architecture, this is a way to do it that is very subtle, and it's a way that all of you may not understand, but the Wabanaki people can recognize that. And that is what you can get when you actually work with someone within that culture, rather than just maybe reading a book and thinking that you understand. So these shapes are really important. And so seeing these round timbers inside of the building, that's important because it is the shape of a tree. And when you walk in, you can recognize that was a real thing. These are all beings, and they're not all cut, rectangular. So looking at these kind of materials, it's another way to think about how you use those materials once you're inside of a building, right? We're starting really big and getting really small, and now I'm talking about one individual column that's round. And then lastly, I just want to talk about a few of the research projects. So this is a 10-story shake table test, and years ago we did a 2 or 3-story shake table test, and there's a consortium of a lot of universities and a lot of companies who, because we're on the West Coast in seismic zones and we have earthquakes, we're talking about how to make buildings resilient. And so one of the ways to do that, because in order to have regenerative architecture and, this whole topic that we're talking about is that we're able to reuse something and we're not building new. So if there's an earthquake now and a building is damaged, it breaks, you have to tear it down. The codes allow you to get out of the building safely. They don't really allow you to use the building again. So there's this wood rocking wall that during an earthquake kind of does this and then resets itself straight. And so there are parts of it that need to be replaced, but the structure of the building is still intact. You can make repairs if windows have broken, and you can use that building all over again and build onto it. And so this is a way of thinking about buildings that are 65 years, or how the kingdom was torn down after 26 years and the other buildings are standing for 2,000 years. I think this is a way to start thinking about that using a natural material and still having a building be able to withstand what it needs to withstand and have us be able to continue to use that and build upon it, and really have this sort of resilient model of architecture that I think is really awesome. So thank you.
So much, Chandra. What an amazing work. Not just beautifully designed and not just beautiful, but also so multi-layered and multi-dimensional.
Yeah.
And I think a true example, and these are not easy to find, of an intimate relationship between your architecture and the ecologies of your architecture.
Yeah.
Even at an intangible level, or as being in a new form.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. Very inspiring. We shall talk more.
Great.
But wonderful. So now we're going to start our conversation, and I'm sure that we have many questions here. But it is a very diverse group, as you mentioned, and we have all these different outlooks. Yeah. I feel that going from the global scale and the warnings that you offered us, Indy, and all the way, to your very specific responses to these macro challenges at the local level, sourcing at the local level, guaranteeing that communities benefit, and these are not just bioeconomies, once again, of just large-scale corporate models. And going through the ecological perspective that you offered, which makes me wonder about our education and whether we, as architects, should start our training with a class on ecology, and looking at the questions that have to do more with the very challenging conditions that we face in the quote-unquote global south, with these massive self-built, self-managed urbanisms. So how do we weave all of this together? Anyone can come up with a brilliant question that can help me here? I guess that maybe I bring Amazonia a little bit to the equation as well, yeah, to bear with all of your responses, because it has to do with forest. It is 80% informal in its urbanism. We are trying to think about how to build not bioeconomic models for the Amazon, but socio-bioeconomic models that are community-based. And also, I feel that right now many are focusing on Amazonia again, because there's a concern with climate change, and deforestation also contributes huge quantities of CO2 to the atmosphere. So I feel that all of you, in one way or another, address issues that I have been trying to figure out and think about in terms of the hierarchical cities that you see there, that are speaking to us in terms of there are new models, there are other ways of being in this planet. I guess that the question that I would have for all of you, because I feel it relates to all of your work, can we reimagine a future in which constructing the city is about constructing microecologies as well, and buildings are part of it and not the other way around? Not ecology as subjugated to the city, but really the city as a regenerative system of ecology, of microecology, additive microecology. Do you think it's possible to imagine this other way?
Yeah, when I think about that, I think about the concept of eco districts, where many buildings will share, a boiler and a cooling system, or will share a geothermal system that's in one area, but then you're not drilling under every building, right? And so how can you, just like we were talking about shared spaces and you were talking about multi-generational families, like the kitchen on the ground floor, like this starts to kind of get to that when you're talking about utilities and energy usage, but it's on sort of like a district scale or a few block scale, right? That starts to make that happen. And when you're in a group and you're understanding that all of your energy use is tied together, it actually does bring you together. You're sort of monitoring one another and saying like, which building is using less water or something like that. But I can really see that happening, and I feel like we're close in some areas. It's like the cooperation between all of those individual entities. How do you get them to agree to share something? It's like, we can't even get a bridge over the river because it's Oregon and Washington. Washington doesn't want to pay for Oregon. Oregon doesn't want to pay for Washington. And it's like, but we can't cross the river if we don't get a new bridge. So I think that's a challenge.
Again, those policies of separation and border versus the policies of the re-entanglement.
Yeah.
Great example, actually.
Yeah, I want to add that, one, I guess I haven't really, I have spoken with the RU team about the materials that they are promoting or using. And it became very clear that, for them, there were two things that were paramount. One was the comfort, that is thermal comfort especially, and materials that would reduce the temperatures and keep the houses thermally comfortable. And the other was, of course, finances, which means that the solutions that they are proposing are necessarily interim and temporary on the way to a situation that Chandra is describing, which may happen in a somewhat distant future, I think. But the first step is really to begin with that, how do you cool down an individual home and or a whole neighborhood, and then from there, using the materials that are at hand, but also lengthening their lifespan. Because at the moment, what happens in the settlements is that people are constantly rebuilding at great cost to themselves, and they're using materials that are discarded materials, toxic, and really not, in many regards. And apparently the team found also that the average number of materials used in the construction of these homes is 40 different types of materials.
Wow.
So in a sense, they're trying to they're beginning with this profile and seeing where it can go. And I think this is it's a medium-term, short to medium-term solution only, but eventually, wanting to get to a point where building a city equals building an ecology, really.
Exactly. And it's interesting because yesterday, in that conversation we had about green chemistry, this notion of diversity of materials came up versus this homogeneity that, there's also a monoculture of materials within architecture. How would you balance, maybe we can go to you as well, this relationship between diversity of materials and maybe a need that we're seeing in this upgrading in Mumbai to homogenizing and maybe even reducing them?
Yeah, I think what strikes me across is Indy charged us that we have to rethink how we're going to solve these problems. We can't solve them the same way. And I think Chandra and Vi showed us ways of rethinking, of reusing materials. And so what we can learn from what you all shared is not the actual design or like the way the houses were built. That would not necessarily be replicated, but it's the process of talking to the people, figuring out the supplies, and then constructing something that is fit to purpose. And I think one thing that we struggle with on the forest management side is, again, we could manage forests in a way to produce massive amounts of wood products in a very industrialized setting. And yesterday in panel 2, it was Keel Mo, I believe, who really gave an impassioned speech against this industrialization of wood products. So what we don't want to do to solve this problem, which would be in the hierarchical mindset, is to mass generate, to take Oregon's forest and just mass generate CLT lumber to build giant high rises to replicate exactly what we have, just without concrete and steel. Instead, what we have to think about is where can we place those facilities, because they're clearly an important part of design, but where do we use other materials? And I guess the other thing I wanted to reflect on was you brought up AI earlier, and there's also an interesting discussion going on in the forestry space where we think there's definitely a contingent of people who think that all of this new digital data, satellite data, remote sensing data that can show us, the global forest, which has a lot of power, is going to solve a lot of these issues and how we think about forest management, because now all of a sudden we can track forest change in real time. But when you talk to the foresters and the people who go into the forest, who source it, they're the ones who have the actual knowledge on the ground of what could or could not be done, or what the potential repercussions are done for the taking of certain trees and not. And so I think there's that disconnect that's really important, that all of these things, we really have to think about how we reprocess what we do.
We need to re-entangle those scales.
Exactly.
Like there's a beautiful example in the Xingu, in the national park in Brazil, where the system that is being used by the groups locally is to plant a community of seeds so that they can have this community of symbiotic forests. And it's a methodology that I don't think we could have found through any technological satellite-based means, but again, this dialogue between the large view and the local knowledge, which is absolutely critical, that I feel all of you work with. And to go back to you, Indy, we have some questions here that I might as well pull out. Can you help me? I don't know why there's this purple surface that is not allowing me to read the questions, but anyway. I maybe did that unintentionally, but thank you. Okay, super. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Did it again. So I guess that a combination of questions for you, Indy, that have come up here is, how do we practically act to facilitate the re-entanglement of everything in the context of everyday work? That's a question from Eva. But we also have another one from Barbara. You may be able to weave these all together. Thank you for a wonderful talk. In your buildings with large glass, I'm sorry, I moved. In arguing for a complex conceptual model of relational dynamic, where and how can individual agency, which sort of relates to the everyday work question, be best lodged to enable chance with spread, avoiding complexity, inertia? And in terms of the responses to the meta crisis, Rebecca says they often point to the need for top-down economic levers to catalyze system change. For example, think of Kim Stanley Robinson's fiction in the Ministry of the Future, where the world must resort to money as carbon. However, this game theoretic approach of tweaking levers to change the incentive landscape often feels at odds with the call to grounded localism, which we've been discussing in our approach. Given the urgency you've emphasized, how do you balance this tension between top-down and bottom-up?
Thank you. Just a massive thank you. I really loved being here, and Alan, for this whole conference. It's been such a pleasure to listen to everyone. I wanted to say a few things. I wanted to go back to your first question, which was about the idea of the regenerative city and building that. I think there's a step-by-step process. One we have to talk about is material justice. So if you look at the level of redundant materials that are lying dormant, unutilized, undeveloped, it's huge, right? So firstly, what does material justice look like of the existing economy? Second, I think that the sharing problem is really a systemic problem. So what I mean by that is that schools in the UK are utilized 17% of the time. So that means 83% of the time they're lying dormant, unutilized. And the problem isn't like functions, the problem is actually the insurance of sharing. So how do you deal with the insurance problem, which is to say, if somebody else is going to use it, how are they going to use it? Are they going to be insured? Are they third parties? This requires a level of institutional innovation that's really critical to be able to deal with this. So this is where I was, I think what we have to reimagine is what's the institutional environments and how do we deal with buildings and our environments in that way. So there's a kind of sharing institutional problem which we have to solve, and there's lots of ways of doing that. I can talk about that. Then I think we get into actually all the beautiful stuff that we're going to see of using our material economy and building this symbiotic economy between the biomaterial economy and the existing, and what I would say is very acupuncture investing to release the capacity of the city. Then what we have to do is, and at the same time, you've got to run the human project. Because I think at the root of this is a reimagination of being human. And if you don't do that work, you still have a relationship of othering with the environment. So the human project works almost at the same time as the reconceptualization of all this. So this is a multi-pronged problem to get to the regenerative city. And also it requires a very... It is across all those layers. And I think we're going to see all our theories of divisibility, property, ownership, and how does, sharing this is not Apple owning it. That's not sharing. Yeah. That's just rental and extraction. So what does it mean to be as custodian of this material economy and Apple being a custodian of this material economy? That's a fundamentally different dynamic to actually just a fractional renting economy. And that custodianship is about me caring for the materials, recognizing they're infinite long life materials. That is a completely different theory of relating to the world. So I point to this just not to point the complexity, but the sequential challenges that we face to be able to open this up. And I think it's all doable, right? None of this stuff is non-doable. And I also don't think we have much of a choice, actually, if you really ask that question. So that's the thing. One thing I wanted to say about top-down versus bottom-up, the reason why we're using top-down incentives or top-down mechanisms, which I don't think are longitudinally going to work, is because we're not doing the human development work. We are trying to do a techno fix of this revolution without doing the human development work that's actually required to flip this whole conversation. I don't want to, if you look back at the history of architecture, it's almost always revolutions are rooted in the reimagination of being human. Modular man, these were all conceits. They were intellectual conceits of what it meant to be human in order to reconceive architecture. So I think without the human project, I don't think we can make these transformations because they will rely on top-down violence. Whereas this is about ennoblement. We have to move away from theories of control as a means of organizing to theories of learning as a means of organizing. That's fundamentally a different theory of organizing. Most of our management theory, most of our organizational theory, most of our supply chain theories are rooted in theories of control orientation. Our standards frameworks are all rooted in theories of control theories, predictability. They're rooted in a material economy of industrial theory, which doesn't allow for variation and tolerance and situational appropriateness. But computational capacity allows us to do this. This is why I think technology is opening up a paradigm of shifting our theory of standards, our situational appropriateness, and able to compute that and make that possible, that allows for this new economy to emerge. So for me, this is a kind of rhyming moment that allows us to rhyme with indigenous and other historic longitudinal ways of being, with technology opening up those pathways to exist at a scale that was unprecedented. And that, I think, is a massive opportunity. And final point, maybe just to open this, I'm also really interested in, let's talk about the Amazon. I think the theory, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this actually, the theory of what I would say the wild versus the controlled. And actually that dichotomy, which has been an intellectual landscape architecture dichotomy, not necessarily an ecologistic dichotomy, has maybe run out of time. And if I understand the history of the Amazon well enough, then you say it's a terra preta environment. It's a cultivated open garden. It's an open garden system. It's a hybrid between cultivation and open ecosystems. And maybe that's a completely different worldview that when we start to see the world, and it relates back to what Mark said yesterday about closed system worldviews versus open system worldviews, maybe this is a completely different paradigm model, which allows us to operate. And that rhymes with past, but with technology opens up that possibility. And that was just something, I think this is the cusp of a really interesting conversation. I mean, like, I think you should all be privileged. Like, genuinely, I feel really privileged to be here in this moment, because I think we're at the moment where we reimagine pretty much everything around us. It's as close to a moment like that, and I think that's such a privilege to be here in that sense. Sorry.
Absolutely, and just to expand on what you just said, and something that you said earlier, Sarah, which is a very present image among ecologists and environmentalists, this chain of being, which is a patriarchal hierarchy with God Father at the top of the hierarchy. And I love what you said. Microorganisms don't even make it, because even rocks are mentioned at the bottom. But and you said, and microorganisms rule the world. So it's this very flawed hierarchical understanding of nature, which is one of the paradigms that are underlying in our subconscious that in a way govern the way we act. And I feel that what I have found in Amazonia and trying to understand Amazonians and its history is what anthropologists call the ontological crisis. Understanding Amazonia forces you to deconstruct this chain of being ontology, which is profoundly embedded in the way we think about everything, which is very hierarchical, and to rethink of everything from the perspective of the community of nature or the society of nature, which is a totally different paradigm that forces us to rethink property, to rethink even the human.
And capital.
Because, you mentioned the rights of nature. That stems from the indigenous movement who have been calling, because as you mentioned, everything is a being. That piece of wood that is now in your architecture continues to be an entity, a sentient, intellectual entity that deserves as much respect as any human. So that is the ontological shift that I feel the indigenous world is, emerging from its deep palimpsest and its deep root to speak to us and say, you cannot continue to be so arrogant anymore. Because we've translated that also into human societies. And it's ironic that Amazonia, this wild, savage land, whether it's the noble savage or the wild savage, the one we like and the one we can't stand, it's suddenly reconceived as a civilizational project. And in a way, what that tells me is that Amazonia was destroyed in the name of civilization. So first it was in the name of Christianization, but then that was not an argument anymore. So in the 18th, 19th century, that Christianization, evangelization project became a project that was civilizational, and that went through pacification and assimilation. And now it's in the name of development. You know what I mean? Because it's the global south that needs to develop to the standards of the global north. We're still thinking hierarchically.
Yeah.
We need to break that further.
About control, like Indy was saying, it's about control, right? It's not, it may seem like a wild place, but we've touched everything, right? We've touched everywhere in the world. And now we're saying, this is a wild place, but we want to cultivate it in some way and change it for ourselves. And I mean, is it better to let it do what it needs to do? Obviously, the ecosystems can repair themselves, but we already have this big problem. So are those forests and ecosystems a way for us to somehow rebalance? And that means we are cultivating it all again, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to take the conversation back to Via a little bit, Precious is asking this question for you. This is a question for all, but beginning with Via. When we are talking about re-entanglement or the telling of a multitude of stories, who are we missing in this room? I'm thinking insurers, lawyers, what professions may make the re-entanglement difficult. So which are the barriers in a way, or the resistance to the re-entanglement project? So
definitely lawyers. Well, I mean, if I was thinking about this question of wilding, and for me, the story of Mumbai is actually a story of a city going from, despite being such a massive population, going from being a kind of a predictable chaos to some extent to becoming what in Hindi would be called jungly, which means really savage, because the word jungle comes from Indian languages. So it's like precisely because these legal development regulations, what they've done is they've introduced an element of total unpredictability into, so these air rights are transferable, so they can move, and they do have some set pathways, which are mostly determined by where can my air rights be transferred such that I earn the most amount of money. But in that process, that could change to another neighborhood. And then in that process, what happens is that you have no idea which neighborhood is going to sort of sprout and become hyper-vertical. And then in that sense, you cannot anticipate what infrastructure might be needed or anything like that. So the only space of control remaining seems to be at a very micro level, where neighbors can get together and do things, as you were suggesting, of managing their needs and their infrastructure and sharing things. But that does not happen through these approaches of, these sort of hyper-legal policy changes.
Can I play with this? Yeah. So I want to build the adjacent thing. I'm seeing, so contract law was a bilateral relationship. It was about bilateral means of organizing. Private contract was the relationship between parties. What computational capabilities are giving us is the capacity to build chain relationships and mass multi-agent relationships. We're also able to not move away from fixed transactions to outcome transactions. We can go for proxies. So I think law, the contractual landscape, is moving and expanding to allow for much larger spaces of indeterminacy. It can also operate through polycapital landscapes, not just financial capital mechanisms, other forms of gift capital. So many of you saw in Melbourne, for example, people were sending love letters to trees. What is that as a currency? So I know there's a reductive component of this. So this, in any form of synthetic contraction or coding, you lose resolution. But what I am saying is the contractual landscape is massively expanding. That will open up a landscape of opportunities. So we can do quasi-self-sovereign rooms sharing themselves for public interest. That is contractually now possible with insurance and citizenship sign-ups. I can construct a piece of contract and insurance framework that allows for the room to be shared automatically for public purpose and public declaration, recording that public declaration. The reduction of that transaction cost means I've massively increased the efficacy of the reuse of materials. So I just want to offer hope, and I recognize the limits of that conversation as well, but I want to offer hope. There's something emerging on that side, and we are working with lawyers and finance people exactly on this story. So I think even finance and contracts are recognizing this re-entanglement issue, and it opens up massive possibilities.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to jump in though. I think the important part is we now have these capabilities to build these contracts, but I still think the ethos of what you both shared is that the people using the space and using the materials had that broader view of where the materials were coming from and what they needed them for. And we're using things available like the fly ash for the walls that got them certain. Exactly. And so I still, the root of the problem is how easy it is to go on Amazon Prime and order whatever it is that you want and have it delivered to your doorstep in 24 hours. And that materials seem infinite and not replaceable. And so until people walk in the woods
or in the grasslands and the sagelands and see what is there and what is possible. I don't think they can capitalize on this computational ability to create these new ways of thinking about material.
I think you're right. Anna also recognized capital is now recognizing the externality risks,
Right.
strategic risks that it's holding. So I think there is a self-terminating, the trajectory we're on basically destroys all of us. And increasingly, anyone that's a universal owner, i.e. is exposed to universal risks, it's basic science now to look at that. So I think there's a sort of desire line coming from the other side, not from a moral perspective even, but just from an enlightened self-interest perspective to say we have to meet again. Mm-hmm. And I think that is really interesting, that you can suddenly start, capital recognizes, financial capital recognizes just one capital of multiple capitals. And in its power with rather than power over, it can release value in a way that's unprecedented and release value for all. So I think there's a generative model in there, but I recognize I'm talking about the very few on the table. But I think there's something really beautiful that is, like, the whole thing about, like, if a community plants a tree, there's a 90% chance of survival because you've got care involved in it. If a local authority, municipality plants a tree, 50% chance of survival. That means there's a 40% delta for care and gift. Right? Yeah. And so I can play, and that means that community is on the table, not for anything, it's on the table because there's real value, not for money, not necessarily the other way. So I just think there's something really interesting pulling in the other way, which is great. Sorry.
And if we go back to thinking about law and the commons, I think that we do need to remember the amazing work that Elinor Ostrom did to show that commons are regulated, that there are micro laws, like there are microecologies, like there are communities, and that they're coming up with their own rules, and it's a very dynamic system that has been overpowered by the top-down ruling of, the rule of law. Mm-hmm. But there is customary law as well, mm-hmm. and I wonder whether somehow that customary law will be able to better intersect and entangle with the top-down positive law of nation states, so to speak, or capitalism.
Can I just play with
to
this?
To create, new symbiosis.
I'm going to be controversial, so I'll say this.
Please.
I think Ostrom's work was obviously brilliant, but Ostrom's work was rooted in what I'd call closed or bounded commons. Mm-hmm. The problem space we have is we're operating at the loss of unbounded commons.
True.
And most of our commons, actually, if you philosophically look at it, are unbounded and fully entangled commons. So we can't solve the problem with the tools that she gave us because we're working in unbounded commons problem spaces. Mm-hmm. So they create the illusion of a local working when the local can't work, because actually we're systemically entangled. The forest is entangled to global timber markets. Mm-hmm. So I do wonder whether there's a really interesting moment for all of us to talk about how do we organize unbounded commons in a really radical way. And that to me is not disrespect to Ostrom's work, which I think was fundamental, but I also want to recognize that the problem space is slightly different.
That's great. Yeah.
And there's an invitation of how this is why I like entanglement, because it's non-bounded. And I think commons as a theory of unbounded commons, I think is more reflective of the reality of any product. There's no boundary to this product if you look at it in space and time. Mm-hmm. It's not a physical thing, it's a sort of ecological thing. Just to put that on the table.
Yeah, but Indy, can't you have both? Like if you look at the hierarchical systems in Amazonia, you have bounded communities managing autonomously their bounded community resource, but they're fully entangled to mega regional networks.
And I'm saying the UK is also entangled to the Amazon. So if the Amazon fails,
Planetary
the UK dies. The United Kingdom doesn't exist if the Amazon doesn't exist. And I don't think we're starting to see that flow.
Right.
Because we're trying to create the illusion of the local. I'm not saying it's not right. I don't think we get home by going local. This was your fundamental question. I think we have to find a new planetary. And the new planetary is not globalization as we've seen it, but it's a new re-entanglement, which is non-bounded. And a non-bounded system invites us to operate with care, with the theory of unintended consequences, operates in sort of relationship with, I think there's a different behavioral response required to deal with it. So I'm just putting it as a little bit of a space that we often fall back to localism, but nothing is local in space and time, right? This is, yeah. Sorry.
So the way I'm thinking about this, and it's much more simplified, but is about how indigenous tribes in Oregon have been working for 50, 60 years to get the dams off of the rivers, right? And we have a problem, like we don't have any salmon anymore, and the orcas in the Sound are dying because all they eat is salmon. And just last year, they were successful in getting this dam off the Klamath River. And within 2 months, the salmon came back. Like generations and generations of all this time, like those salmon had never been up there because they couldn't get up there, right? But they knew to come back, and now they're there. But it's like, if Oregon puts a dam on this river, then what happens to Idaho and Montana? And, you know, so that's unbounded commons, right? Because it's touching everything else. And we can make an impact, you know, through policy. Government makes an impact by deciding that we're putting a dam on this river, and we're taking the waters, like, you know, LA, like no one has water. I don't know why people move there anymore. There's no water. They're only taking water from the unbounded commons from everywhere else. So those folks don't have water. And I think it's just a good example of like what can happen if you recognize that your resource is part of the unbounded commons. I don't know what comes after that, but that's what I was thinking of when you said that.
And I love it. And I'm trying to say that I'm not sure I know how to deal with this problem,
Yeah.
but I recognize that's a more genuine problem space of the unbounded commons.
Yeah.
And if we could work towards how we govern unbounded commons, I think we get into a really interesting question space.
I mean, another way of thinking about it might be that, you know, Ostrom's theory and much of what we know, understand about the commons comes from it being a kind of a negative space to the space that is owned.
Yeah.
And that has clear kind of recognition
Yeah.
of title. And that's the problem, I think. It's you know, how do we change that relationship, the dynamic of the owned and the enclosed and the common, right?
Yeah, but aren't we looking at it through the perspective of separation? In the sense that I feel like I'm thinking about anthropologists and ethnographers. In the Amazon, they used to study like one community.
Yeah.
So they saw it as an isolated resource system that was bounded. But when they started understanding that these were mega distributed rhizomatic networks, the community is not unentangled to a massive regional network of other communes. That doesn't mean it loses its autonomy and a certain degree of boundedness that it's sort of necessary for that community to establish relationships of care that are human, non-human, and beyond human. So I think that we need to sort of like think outside of the planetary urbanization, dendritic network of centralization of control, but understanding that the commons is not this isolated cell that is unrelated to everything else, because those systems of separation and isolation were created through the tearing of these networks as indigenous peoples in the Amazon were fleeing the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English and the French. So, and because of the pandemics. So the reaction was like, I need to be fugitive and I need to be isolated. But that's a condition we created through colonialism. These were networks, and they were networks of commons. So, you know, we can think of the commons in a non-planetary way. And it's possible, but it's like, how do we deal with this dendritic, hierarchical, centralizing network, Silicon Valley and the world, versus distributed, community-based, you know, rhizomatic networks? I feel that's a critical question for the future.
I think we're all talking about the localization of something
as an isolated thing
at the same time, you know, as this unboundedness. So how do we think those two things together?
I still think, so I agree with what you're saying. Whales are an ecosystem that spans half the planet. Pollinators are working in a completely different. I just think we're trapped in the object form still, trying to go networks of objects. You know, when you do the first journey into systems is you kind of go, it's not an object, it's objects with these flow lines in it and these feedback loops. And then you go slightly further and you say it's not the objects, these are fields and field intensity systems. And I think there's a paradigm here that we're about to cross over when you don't see it through theories of boundary and defensibility, but relationalities. These are field system relationalities, which I think is, you know, there's a limit of what I can see. But I think planetarity for me is really interesting because I don't think we can separate the Amazon from everyone here, or the Greenland ice shelf, or whales, which are carbon sequestrating, or we are living in the crisis of the planetary. And that's not a crisis of globalization. Globalization is dead. Globalization was an abstraction model of how we consumed and externalized. I think there's a new relationship being made available to us, and I think that is not going to be resolved by returning to the illusion of the local. I don't think there is a return to the local, and I think it's an illusion. And I actually think it's a political illusion rooted in idea of defensibility of the small, and recognizing you can preserve yourself. And I'm sorry, all the data is telling us there is no New Zealand strategy for the rich. You cannot retire to New Zealand and save yourself, because you will not have antibiotics, silicon, you will not have anything. So this re-entanglement is a planetary re-entanglement, and it forces us to actually deal with the conceit of localism as a thesis. And I think there's something new here. I suppose that's sort of the line I want. There's something new. Yeah. And I think let's enjoy it rather than trying to fight back.
But maybe we are thinking about the scale at which action happens, right? And that is not necessarily a planetary one.
Yeah.
But I think the scale at which action happens, has to be almost certainly local. But if people can have the view of the impact being beyond, and I guess I just wanted to jump in and say, I think a lot about wildfires, and those seem to be a way to get outside of the commons, right? We get wildfire smoke from Canada. We get wildfire smoke blowing. It goes in a lot of places. I think that is like a tangible way for people in Washington, D.C. to understand an impact of a wildfire when they have 3 days of terrible weather. And then the other thing I sort of just thinking, I think these are the types of questions way down under the hood that are happening at the international level with international negotiations on with the UNFCCC on carbon accounting, like really boring stuff on carbon accounting, but with forest, where there's a like real recognition that there's all these forested nations that have not been heavily deforested but could. And so how do we equitably share resources around the globe to make sure that those forested regions don't become like the outskirts of the Amazon that are rapidly being deforested with huge consequences, but still, and so they're not getting, we've had 3-4 decades of these international negotiations that still haven't come up with a big standard or framework. But I think what they're really wrestling with is this idea of the unbounded commons, of that what you do in a forest space in one place will affect a forest in another place because of global wood markets. And
there are questions of autonomy as well that are very important to indigenous peoples, and we cannot underestimate that.
Yes.
But anyway, just to wrap up, because we're over time, so I'm going to link the last 2 questions by Alan and Iskander because they're interrelated. But basically, Alan disposing this statement, recent political trends demonstrate that individuals and social groups are loath to give up the resources they control. Yeah. In the inevitable re-entanglement, will advanced capitalism relent? Will its proponents and primary beneficiaries be absorbed, or will it be a violent transition? Is it an interspecies communitarian equilibrium ecosystem or archive? And another one that's related, Iskander, is inviting us to think as well as about what's happening right now. He says, while all of the ideas proposed in the discussion are providing hope, they have to be put in perspective with the political moment. Fascism and white supremacy on the rise all over the globe, and its fundamental extractive nature wants the eradication of the multiple initiatives discussed today. How can we bring those ideas to life in the face of such a hostile and destructive political force? So,
So we've got the rest of the conference, right?
So maybe, with this provocation, we sort of just try to quickly offer. That's too much.
It's chaotic, and I honestly, the only thing I can think of is to invite my own chaos to try and push back against it, right? If a lot of the systems and things that we rely on that we think other people think are important now are being broken, maybe there's other systems that are not working for us that we can break to improve what we're doing. I don't know exactly what I want to break, but I want to break a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the question of ownership is very important because it's both political and economic. So bringing back this notion of political economy, the possession translates into representational identities and representational forms of politics as well. So the way we define interest, self-interest, all of these things definitely have a bearing upon how we deal with this crisis. And I don't know, things can change even at that huge scale if we are beginning to reshape this notion of ownership and what is common, what is not common, and that when we start treating architecture or the very fundamentally object-based practices as producers of gifts rather than as producers of objects of possession, then maybe, I don't know.
I don't think I have anything wise or profound to say in response to that, but I like Chandra's thought that as things are being broken, what are things that we can break that also can maybe get us to some of these bigger goals and ideas, and thinking in new ways. And control is hard to give up, which is what we're seeing. But I guess I'll come back to the vulnerability discourse that we have on ecosystems. In the very Western Euro-colonial sense, we think of ecosystems as vulnerable because then we can control, right? Then we get vulnerable things need something to patronize and to control them. And so I think breaking down even those visions that we have about ecosystems as not being vulnerable, as being something we would work with and not control, is something that needs to happen across sort of the landscape of how we think of conservation and restoration of nature. And so those are the kind of things that we should be breaking in all areas. And I think that's where we get to this new innovation of how do we live within these ecosystems to do what we want to do.
Mm-hmm. I think the political environment we're seeing is retrospectively an inevitable consequence of the re-entanglement, right? As things re-entangle, we are challenging our theory of identity as separate individual beings, and that is causing a reaction in the system. So I think my thing here would be, how do places like Yale have the ability and the space to create the deepest conversations here? I think what I've enjoyed about this conversation is that this hasn't been an us or them conversation. What it's tried to say is there's something else going on deeper in the system. And we have to construct the politic of tomorrow through another layer of the conversation. And I often worry that we construct the politics from the symptoms that we see happening in the world rather than the deep code transformations that we're in the middle of, in recognition of those vulnerability as power domination theses that are being played out. And this re-entanglement is such a deep reconfiguration of society. So if we work in that humility of that conversation is such a depth, Yale and places like Yale have the profoundness and the time and space to go deep into these codes. That, I think, is really important in moments like this. I think there's other places of what I would call reaction and the fight, but places like this should be advancing the depth of a new politic. And I think that's really vital, because I think you are going to be rare in a moment of actually systemic chaos.
And it's hard to, wrap up such an amazing conversation, but I'll try to do it as an architect with visuals. So what I see is two networks, and they're both planetary, but one of them is not about material justice. One has been about centralization and control, and it is planetary, and it's a dendritic network, and it's making sure it accumulates resources and energy and everything in, very few places, while other places are being dispossessed. But there's another potential network that is community-based, that is distributed, that is heterarchical, and that it's growing from the bottom up, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't achieve planetary scale. But these two networks are not getting along very well. One is about bringing us all together, re-entangled in this distributed network, but the other one is about continuing control and centralized dendritic networks. So what will the outcome be? I think that from the perspective of sustainability, it is very clear that the one that's sustainable and has hope in the future is the distributed one. But it will not be an easy growth. But, thank you for this space and for this conversation, Alan.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been wonderful.